Hello, everyone. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our office investigates complaints of civil rights discrimination, combats human trafficking, ensures equitable language access to county government services, and builds programming to educate on civil rights and social justice and to build community across the diverseness that is our county. With me today as co-hosts are Tiana Davis from the Office of Human Rights and Dr. Audrey Lau from the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. And together, it is our pleasure to welcome you to another episode of Social Justice in Community, our partnership series between our office, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, and the University of Maryland. This series was brought to us by Dr. Chris Marsh of the University of Maryland, and it looks at questions like, how does human rights research impact our communities? How does scholarship on human rights violations or issues of social justice have any meaning in our day-to-day lives? And what is being discussed, studied, and thought about in universities today? We bring human rights scholars into conversation about how their work illuminates human rights struggles around us and what we can do about those struggles. Today, we're really excited to welcome Carolyn Robbins, presenting on Abolition is a Human Right. Carolyn Robbins is a current PhD student, almost a PhD, which we're going to hear about during our conversation, in rhetoric and political culture. Prior to attending the University of Maryland, Carolyn earned her BA in Sociology and Philosophy and her MA in Communication with a focus on rhetorical criticism from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Her scholarly pursuits focus on the rhetoric surrounding mass incarceration. She is particularly interested in the ways public memory, circular reasoning, and tautology come together to maintain hegemonic power structures. Outside of her research, Carolyn works to engage her students in collaborative learning exercises and meaningful discussions about advocacy. Carolyn, welcome. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this series. Public scholarship is something that's really important to me. And I think particularly those of us in the academy who do work related to populations that we're not part of necessarily, and do work related to advocacy and activism, have a responsibility to bring that to the community. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity.
It's good to have you.
Thanks. So yeah, I can go ahead and get started if you wouldn't mind putting my slides up. Okay, so today my presentation is called Abolition is a Human Right. And as Kyla just mentioned, I am almost Dr. Carolyn Robbins, and my pronouns are she, her. So just to introduce myself quickly here. So this is, as you can see, my son, the most important man in my life, my cat. His government name is Emerson, but we call him Mr. Baby. So I have almost my PhD in communication on the rhetoric and political culture track at UMD. I currently am an instructor of record teaching argumentation and public policy, which is COM 330. Mr. Baby is the best cat name. And I'm working on my dissertation called Rhetorics of Riot, Attica Archives, and Affect. So for that dissertation, I traveled to several different archives around, well, I think they were all on the East Coast. And I looked at various artifacts related to the Attica prison riot of 1971. And so as an abolitionist scholar and person, it's really important to me to have this experience. And I've actually, it's one thing to read about this. It's another thing to actually touch and see and smell the things that were there. A lot of the artifacts I looked at actually had residual tear gas on them from when the state troopers gassed the incarcerated men, and I had to wear a mask and stuff like that to protect myself 53 years later. So I think it's really important to bring this kind of work to the public. And as I said, I have my master's and my bachelor's from Baylor University. I also have a podcast that's called Getting Critical with Carolyn. It's available on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, where I podcast along with what I'm teaching each week. It's a resource for my students, right? So if they don't come to class, I can just say, listen to the podcast. But it also is a resource for the general public just to kind of be able to take my class for free. So feel free to give that a listen if you want. I have a couple abolition episodes on there as well. And I'm also desperately looking for a job. So if anyone out there is hiring someone of my talents, please hire me, please. Okay. So back to business. Today, I will be discussing abolition in kind of three phases. I'll define abolition for us. I will talk about some of the history of abolition, and then take a look at what abolition looks like today. So with that in mind, the way that I designed this presentation was kind of to introduce the field of abolition and the concept of abolition to those who might not be familiar. So if you're already familiar, most of this might be a review for you, but if it's new to you, hopefully you're going to learn something, and I think we can have a really great conversation together after we get through this information. So to get started, this is Mariame Kaba. She is an abolitionist and a scholar. She is just truly excellent. She has a book that she wrote with another abolitionist that's called "We Do This Till We Free Us." That book is a collection of essays where she talks about abolition. She talks about her experiences and her journey toward abolition. I have a book over here, but it's underneath my lamp and I don't want to knock my lamp over, but I'll show it to you later. It's called Becoming Abolitionists by Derricka Purnell. That's another excellent book that talks about the journey of abolition for those who might want to learn more. So I pulled this definition, pardon me, that Mariame Kaba gave during one of her many interviews, because I think it gets at a lot of the moving parts of abolition. So Kaba says, my understanding of prison industrial complex, or PIC, abolition, is that it's a vision of a restructured society where we have everything that we need to live dignified lives, a project of collective care, to eliminate prisons, policing, and surveillance, and we want to create true safety, health, and well-being instead. PIC abolition is necessarily anti-racist and anti-oppressive. Dismantling capitalism is central to PIC abolition. PIC abolition has to be anti-imperialist, internationalist, and global in a reciprocal way. PIC abolition has to be feminist, and PIC abolitionists are concerned with ending sources of all violence. So I think a lot of times when we originally are presented with the idea of abolition, what a lot of folks picture is like, let's just take a wrecking ball to all the prisons, the end. And that is, I think, that's an unfair representation of what abolition is. And I mean, the word abolish has a destructive connotation, but when we think about abolition as a social movement, it's actually really deeply creative. It's about addressing a bunch of different problems in our society. And so I think that Mariame Kaba captures a lot of what that means here. And it's not just about prisons, it's about the entire prison industrial complex. And so that term comes from Dwight Eisenhower's military industrial complex, talking about how war and the military are good for the economy. They benefit each other, right? War creates jobs. Killing people is profitable. And that's the same thing with prisons. Incarcerating people is profitable. It creates jobs. It creates cheap labor. And it stimulates the economy. And so it is capitalist to the core. And that's part of what I think Kaba's definition recognizes here, is that capitalism cannot exist without exploitation, and the prison industrial complex is inherently exploitative. So I think that this little cartoon is kind of helpful when we think about abolition, because a lot of times when I say I'm an abolitionist, people are kind of like, okay, that's cute, good luck with that. But the thing is, we've done it before. We have our first little guy from 1859 saying, abolish slavery. Sorry, but that's never going to happen. I do wish things could be better, but that's just the way the world is. And besides, how else would we run our economy? Right. And then we did abolish slavery, right? 1865, the Civil War ended. We get the Emancipation Proclamation. 1953, we have another guy. Abolish segregation. Sorry, but that's never going to happen. I do wish things could be better, but that's just the way the world is. And besides, isn't it best if we're all separate? And again, we no longer have legalized segregation, right? And saying those things now sounds ridiculous and very clearly racist, right? But then we get to 2020. Abolish the police. Sorry, but that's never going to happen. I do wish things could be better, but that's just the way the world is. And besides, how else would society maintain order? Right? So we see this pattern. We all want to think, oh, well, if I had been alive during slavery, of course I would have been an abolitionist, right? It's so clearly wrong. But these are the same ideas. Slavery still exists in the United States. So guess what? If you think you could have been an abolitionist when slavery existed, you still have that opportunity today. So I made this beautiful chart. Graphic design is my passion. What can I say? To show all these kind of interconnected issues that we use the prison industrial complex as a response to, right? So mass incarceration, big problem in our society, right? But we try to just continue incarcerating our way out of that. We have problems with addiction, homelessness, poverty, domestic violence, mental illness, illegal immigration, sexual violence, racism, right? Not only are all of these things connected to the prison industrial complex, but they're all connected to each other. It's a big, complicated web. It's what we call a wicked problem. And when you have a wicked problem that is complex like this, you can't address it with a singular solution. Kava, who I mentioned earlier, has a really helpful metaphor here, I think, that if the prison industrial complex is a hammer, we treat all of society's problems like nails, right? But most things are not nails. The vast majority of things in our world are not nails. And most of the things in the world, if we hit them with a hammer, are not going to improve, right? Even if you just think about trying to build a house, right? If society is a house, if the only tool you have is a hammer, good luck installing your windows, right? Have fun with the plumbing. And personally, I'm not interested in living in a house that was built with only a hammer. That seems pretty unsafe and unstable to me. I think we should have multiple tools. And in fact, if you told me I built a house with every tool except for a hammer, I would be more interested in that than a house that was built with only a hammer. So this graphic here helps us kind of visualize what that could look like. So abolition is creative, right? It's not just saying, let's throw out this teapot. It's saying we have all this tea in this one teapot, but nobody can drink it if it's all in this one teapot. So what if instead of putting all of these resources into the police and military to continue trying to deal with every single problem that plagues us, we use this money to fund things like education, universal healthcare, youth services, housing, and the Green New Deal, right? All of these things that would address a lot of harms in our society that would render prison unnecessary. I think prison is already unnecessary, right? But if you think that prison is an appropriate response to crime, if we had a lot of these programs already in place and well-funded, like we have the police and the military, those crimes would not happen. So I want to walk you through a little bit of the history of abolition here to kind of think about how did we get to where we are today. So this is where we are today. The United States incarcerates more of its people than any other nation per capita. We have, I believe, 1/5 of the world's population and that's wrong. We have 5% of the world's population. Sorry, I don't do math. 5% of the world's population, yet we have 20% of the world's incarcerated population. So we are over-incarcerating our people by a lot. And you can see, if this kind of chart tickles your brain like it tickles mine, the Prison Policy Initiative created this. They have a lot of really helpful graphics to help understand incarceration issues on their Instagram and on their website. So the Prison Policy Initiative is a great source for more information on this topic. But you can see the vast majority of these people are in state prisons and local jails. So the difference between prison and jail, this is something I didn't know. Jail is pre-trial and or shorter sentences. So people in jail have often not been convicted yet. They just can't afford bail. So legally, they are considered innocent. Yet they are still incarcerated because we have a cash bail system. So jail criminalizes poverty in many ways. Prison is for everyone who is in prison has been convicted, and it's generally for longer sentences. But because prisons are set up for longer sentences, they tend to have more resources than jails. So sometimes folks who are convicted to a sentence in jail actually try to bargain for a longer sentence so they can go to prison instead of jail, because jails are more crowded and less resourced. And then another much smaller portion we see in federal prison. And then we have youth incarceration, immigration detention, involuntary commitment, and then some smaller portions, right? So there's lots and lots of different types of incarceration in our country. And we do it more than anyone else. So what's up? How did we get here? Why is it like this? So 1565 we see the first enslaved people brought to North America. So the Spanish colonized what would later become St. Augustine, Florida, and they brought African slaves with them against the will of those African people. Also, this is a condensed version of the Yale abolitionism timeline. There's a lot more information there if anyone is interested in looking that up. And then in 1619, you may have heard of the 1619 Project. That is kind of considered to be the beginning of U.S. American slavery. Because although 1565 was the first enslaved person brought to North America, it was not yet considered North America or the United States at that time. So 1619, an English colony enslaved people for the first time. So a Dutch vessel arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, which was an English colony at this time. So this is before the Revolutionary War, right? We're still English colonies. But they brought 20 slaves with them. So the first enslaved people are brought to the United States when it was a colony in 1619. So then by 1808, we start seeing some moves toward abolition. The 19th century was a big one for abolition. So 1808, the United States outlawed the importation of slaves. So you could no longer bring new slaves to the United States at this time. And so the, oh, my computer's trying to update. Not right now, thank you. Okay, exciting. Okay, so it wasn't outlawing enslavement. It was just saying we can't bring new slaves here. So people who were already here and were enslaved and their descendants could still be enslaved. By 1822, Liberia had been founded as an African colony for freed American slaves. So if American slaves were no longer enslaved, they would ship them to Liberia, which was not home for the vast majority of these people, but I guess it's sort of abolitionist, but I don't know. I think that was kind of a weird move. So then we get to 1833 and the American Anti-Slavery Society is formed. So we have a more like concentrated and organized effort toward abolition. And the abolitionist newspaper called The Emancipator is launched by a man named Arthur Tappan. So 1863, right, we're getting into the Civil War, started in 1861. And the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect 1863. So as of January 1st, 1863, Lincoln declared that all persons held as slaves shall be thenceforward and forever free. Cool. Here's the thing, most of them couldn't read. So a lot of people didn't know that they were free, and the people who owned them were not about to tell them that. So the Emancipation Proclamation was, I mean, it was important, but it didn't necessarily accomplish what it set out to accomplish. And then by 1865, when the Civil War officially ends, we get the 13th Amendment to the to the Constitution that outlaws slavery, except as punishment for a crime. So slavery is illegal unless you've committed a crime. So here's the text of the 13th Amendment. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So there's a cute little loophole here that if someone is convicted of a crime, it is totally fine to enslave them. If that troubles you, you are correct, right? That is a major problem. And so slavery doesn't actually end. Slavery goes incognito. It goes into the prisons, right? Because now, if we can find ways to convict certain people of certain kinds of crimes, we can continue to legally enslave those people. So we see our criminal justice system, criminal legal system, as many abolitionists call it, because they don't want to use the word justice. Our criminal legal system starts to unequally target poor people, people of color, queer people, disabled people, immigrants, right? All of these groups that we still see incarcerated at disproportionate rates. And so the way that this happens is because crime and harm are not the same thing. So a lot of things that are declared crime don't actually cause any harm. And a lot of things that cause harm are not actually considered crimes, right? Crime is a legal definition. So, for example, when we create laws that ban loitering, loitering is just like existing somewhere where you're not supposed to exist, right? That's not actually harming anyone to just like stand there, right? But that becomes a crime because it is more common among young Black men to stand on the corner or whatever they're considering to be loitering, right? Anti-camping laws. No one is actually like, wow, I think it'd be really super fun to go camp in DuPont Circle, right? That is targeting homeless people. Homeless people, disproportionately poor, people of color, people who have addiction issues and mental health issues, right? So none of these things are a coincidence. And it is all designed to funnel people, disproportionately Black people, into the prison industrial complex to continue to enslave them, which is legal under the 13th Amendment. So when people are incarcerated, we can see the involuntary servitude that is going on. So again, these are from the Prison Policy Initiative. Their graphics are just amazing. So on the left, we can see mandatory or voluntary. So 71% of incarcerated people who are working, who have jobs, are required to work. They're not working because they want a job. They're working because they have to have a job. 29% choose to work. And then on the right, we can see whether they're paid or unpaid. So 39% of folks who are working jobs in prisons are paid nothing. And that is legal in some states. 61% are paid for their work technically, but they're paid about 13 cents per hour on average. Which, I mean, I'm a grad student, but even I make more than 13 cents per hour. And so I just, it's almost more insulting to be paid 13 cents per hour than to be paid nothing, just to say, oh, you're not a slave, you make 13 cents an hour, right? And then in a lot of places, they have to turn around and use the wages to make a phone call, buy a stamp to send a letter. If you want to, like, all the food in prison is like horrible. We all know this, right? So a lot of times they'll buy food from the commissary. So if you want to buy a pack of ramen noodles and that is $1 at commissary, you make 13 cents per hour. One pack of ramen noodles is a full day's work. So I personally find it disgusting. And I don't think it's right. And I think it goes against everything that America purports to stand for. And then, so if we look at the chart on the right, formerly incarcerated people also face alarming rates of joblessness. So a lot of times you'll hear the argument that having a job in prison is good because it prepares you. You can get a job on the outside once you're out. That is not true. A lot of times the jobs people are working in prisons are not preparing them for anything because they're working with outdated equipment, right? So when you get out of prison, you don't actually have the skills. It's also pretty much impossible to get a job if you have to check the box that you have a felony. So if we look at this chart, I'm not sure that how big the numbers are for y'all, so I can go ahead and share. So within 6 months of release, 62% of people were not employed. Let's see, this is compared to the highest record US employment rate. So the blue bar is US peak unemployment, which is 15%. The yellow bar is 6 months post-release, 62% of people not employed. 1 year post-release, 63% of people not employed. 2 years post-release, 64%. 3 years post-release, and 4 years post-release, 65%. So this argument that it's job preparation is not supported by any kind of statistical measure or any kind of reality and lived experience. So let's think about abolition today. So I wanted to share my definition of abolition with all of you. The reason that I've set up this presentation kind of as past, present, and future is because I believe that abolition has to be historically informed, presently enacted, and future oriented. So abolition is creative, collective, and collaborative movement with the goal of dismantling the prison industrial complex. Abolitionists believe in addressing the root causes of crime through transformative justice and handling harms caused to society through restorative justice. Abolition is, I just said this, historically informed, presently enacted, and future-oriented. It is a radical act of hope and resistance that dares to envision and take action toward a liberated future. And so when I think about abolition, these terms transformative justice and restorative justice come to mind. So one of the major paradigm shifts of abolition that abolition asks us to take is moving away from this crime and punishment paradigm and thinking about harm rather than crime. So abolitionists don't believe that if we abolish prisons and use the funding for community programming, that suddenly nobody's ever going to harm anyone else ever again, right? We're not stupid. We know people are not perfect. Harms and crimes will continue to happen. And so restorative justice is this idea of restoring the harm that is caused, right? So if somebody harms you and they go to prison, the harm to you still exists. All that's happened is we have now caused more harm to that person and their family. We've created more harm in society. And so restorative justice asks, how can we look at this kind of case by case and figure out how to restore the harm that's actually been caused, right? And so in some cases, like let's say somebody steals your car. If that person goes to prison, you still don't have a car and now their life is over. So maybe they have to return your car or they have to work enough to pay you back for the value of the car, right? That would be restorative justice. In other cases, when we think about things like sexual assault, right, you probably don't want to see, the victim probably doesn't want to see the aggressor, right? How can we restore harm there? Again, putting that person in prison doesn't do anything to solve the harm that has already occurred, right? So it's thinking about ways to respond to things like that. Transformative justice says, let's look at why crimes occur in the first place and why people cause harm in the first place and address those causes so that the harm doesn't happen, right? So a lot of people harm others because they are facing addiction or they're mentally ill or they're living in poverty, right? Or there's some kind of like larger issue that they can't deal with that compounds over time, right? Nobody wakes up in the morning and is like, God, it'd be so fun to go kill people, but I don't want to go to prison, so I guess I won't, right? Nobody is having that thought process. Prisons are not what's stopping us from killing each other. And so when we fund things like education and healthcare and housing and mental health care resources, and we fund things like gun control measures, and we remove ourselves from capitalist oppression and neoliberalism that separates us and makes us all super individualized, right? That's transformative justice. That is changing the conditions that even led to the harm occurring in the first place. And then restorative justice is responding when harm still does occur. So again, abolition is not going to completely get rid of any harm or any crime, but it's not like what we're currently doing is handling that either, right? We incarcerate the most people per capita of any developed nation in the world, and yet crime still happens every single day. So our current solution to this problem is not actually a solution. And so there's another kind of metaphor here, again from Miriam Kava, because she's the metaphor queen, that helps us to understand this, where she talks about how abolition, it's like washing the dishes, right? You wash the dishes, you have a cleared out sink, there's going to be another dirty dish, and you have the choice to either ignore all of the dirty dishes and continue not to wash them, or to wash them as they come in. Keep handling it as it happens, right? It's not a one-time solution that solves everything forever, but we still got to wash the dishes. So some examples, right? Universal healthcare access is an abolitionist undertaking, right? If people can get care for their healthcare problems, they are less likely to use drugs. They are more likely to receive treatment for drug addiction if they're experiencing that, right? Things like mental health issues, things like pregnancy and childbirth, right? All these kinds of issues that can really affect a person's mental and physical health. Universal healthcare access can greatly diminish those problems, which then helps people from resorting to crime, whether that is based on like medical bankruptcy or drug addiction, those kinds of things. In Oregon, there's a program called CAHOOTS that stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. This is an alternative to the police. So if you call 911 and they say, "What's your emergency?" and you say, "Someone is having a mental health crisis," they will send cahoots instead of the police, right? If you're having a medical emergency, they send an ambulance without police, right? If your house is on fire, they send the fire trucks without the police, right? So it's thinking about when police are necessary, which is pretty much never, and then responding with an actual trained person to assist you in that issue, right? Because if someone is having some sort of mental health psychotic break and you send a police officer, it never helps the situation. It generally escalates the situation, and we've seen countless examples of it ending up with the person having the crisis dead. Same thing in Denver. There's a group called STAR, Support Team Assisted Response. Again, you call 911 and they might dispatch STAR to you instead of police. In Native communities, we see tribal peace circles as a way to deal with harm among their societies. So in these peace circles, it's a transformative and restorative justice practice based in discourse and based in reparations rather than punishment. And then, of course, as I've referenced a few times, we have the defund the police movement, right? So instead of pouring all of our money into police, like if you look at your state or city budget, so much of your money as a taxpayer is going to police. Whereas if you live near me, all the roads are full of potholes, right? And I see homeless people asking me for money every single day. But, thank God we have 1 billion cops, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we can use that funding. And I think that these two graphics are also helpful, kind of like the teapot one. So we see US police budget, $115 billion. Defunding the police is scooping that budget out, right? We have affordable housing, job training, education, mental health counseling, substance abuse treatment, right? All of these things are better ways to spend the money to accomplish the purpose that we say we want the police to accomplish. And what it boils down to is that the stated purpose of prisons and police are not actually the purposes that they serve or that we want them for. And I'll get into that in a moment. And if we look at the graphic on the right, we see the little police mouse carrying all these boulders: keep the peace, theft, homelessness, domestic violence, drug possession, gang violence, drug dealers, prostitution, social security. And the other little mouse is saying, abolish the police. He says, abolish the police. How is he supposed to carry all that? And then in the bottom graphic, it says he's not. And we see a bunch of other people moving these boulders. We see affordable housing, decriminalization and regulation of sex work and drugs. We see social workers, mental health services, drug treatment programs, education, job placement, and universal health care, right? So redistributing the resources that we have already. It seems like it shouldn't be that radical of an idea, but people don't like it, in my experience. So we see a lot of carceral arguments about maintaining the prison industrial complex, and then we have some abolitionist responses, right? So we have this argument that prisons keep us safe. If prisons kept us safe, we would expect to see an inverse relationship between crime rates and incarceration rates, right? So as more people are incarcerated, there's less crime. That is not true. If you look at any crime statistics from the last 60 years, that's not true. There's no relationship between incarceration rates and crime rates. And then we have the famous question, what about the rapists and the murderers? There's a couple responses to that. Number one, where lots and lots of rape and murder occurs in the United States is inside of prisons. So if you are anti-rape and anti-murder, you are fundamentally anti-prison. Also, we incarcerate the most people per capita of any developed nation. Rape and murder still happen. So what we're currently doing, I could also ask, what about the rapists and the murderers? Because rape and murder are still happening under our carceral system. Most people who commit sexual assault or rape are never incarcerated for it. Then we get this idea that we need the police. They keep us safe. They stop crime. Well, according to a 2020 study of the New York NYPD, police spent less than 4% of their time responding to crimes and even less of it intervening in active crimes. So police, like, we have all this propaganda, right? We have all the shows about police officers where, you know, it's the big moment, the guy's about to pull the trigger, and then the hero cop kicks down the door and takes him down, and everybody's safe, right? That does not happen. In reality, what happens is a crime happens, someone calls the police, they maybe show up later, and they write some stuff down. The end, right? They're generally not kicking down doors and getting the bad guys. And I don't know if you saw in 2020, when this study came out, there were a lot of videos circulating where, like, it was a trend for people to video NYPD officers monitoring the subways, and they were always just on their phones. And so it's like your tax dollars hard at work, you know, crushing candy or whatever, you know, checking Twitter. But they spent less than 4% of their time even responding to crime. So even after a crime has occurred, going and like dealing with it. So you can imagine how little time is actually spent intervening in active crimes. And then finally, we need prisons to punish people. Prisons punish people and they pay their debt to society, and it teaches them a lesson. I don't think anyone actually believes this, right? So the example I like to give my students is, all right, so prisons allow people to pay their debt to society. You go to prison, you learn your lesson, you're rehabilitated, you get out. So if you're going home to mom for Thanksgiving, and you're like, Mom, I'm bringing my new boyfriend. You're going to love him. He just did 15 years in federal prison. Is mom going to be like, wow, he sounds like an upstanding citizen? Of course not, right? Mom's going to be like, get away from him. He's a criminal. He's a bad person. Because we don't actually believe that prisons are rehabilitating people or allowing them to pay their debt to society. But that's not actually why we use them. Right? We use prisons to maintain racial hierarchies. We use prisons to enslave people. We use prisons to maintain capitalism. We use prisons for cheap and free labor. And so if we look at the actual purposes of prisons, it's very ugly. And so the answer is abolition. And that is scary because prisons and policing and the whole prison industrial complex are so ingrained in the American psyche of how society works that the idea of imagining a society without prisons feels really vulnerable. And people don't like it. Because when you start pulling on that thread of, well, do prisons actually keep us safe? Is punishing people actually doing anything to make our society better? Do police actually protect us from harm? When you start pulling at that thread, right, it goes all the way up to the whole tapestry of capitalism, right? And you start unraveling that, and people don't like that, right? And part of that is because we live in a neoliberal society where everything is so individualized. And so abolition rejects all of that. Abolition says we're going to be collective, we're going to be a community, we're going to radically imagine different possibilities together. And in doing this, it is an act of rejection and rebellion toward the powers that be and toward the hierarchies that govern us. Because to imagine this future is a step toward making it possible. So we have to break the cycle. We constantly see police violence, community outrage, and then people call for reform, calls for training and cultural change, right? We need more body cams, right? More training. Then there's no meaningful change, and we start the cycle again. We have to break the cycle. And the way to do that is through abolition. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. If you want to chat about it, you can get in touch. My email is robinc@umd.edu. You can find me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Carolyn-Robbins-PhD. You can also scan this link to listen to my podcast if you want to, and also another picture of my cat because why not? I'm happy to I can put this back up if people want to take a picture or anything. But other than that, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That really gave us, there was a lot to think about in there. And I'm going to start because I have questions actually from your bio. So as a point of full disclosure, I went back to university when I was 35 and people would use words and I didn't know what they were. Yep. And so I found such a word in your bio for me, but there was also a word that I learned from university, but I thought I would share. So in your bio, you'd use two things. You talk about hegemony or hegemonic, which thanks to Dr. Gordon Hack, I do know what that means, but I realize some of our viewers might not be familiar with that. And the other thing that you have in your bio is tautology, which I thought if you could just start us off by just even giving us some context for those words, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So, hegemony or hegemonic power is like dominant power structures. So, things that govern the way that we think about and interact with each other and with our society. So, this is things like white supremacy, capitalism, misogyny, heterosexism, anti-trans beliefs, right? Anything like that. So, these dominant power structures and thought structures that if we do not examine critically, we perpetuate. So that's what hegemony means. And then tautology is where you kind of, it's this sneaky little rhetorical tactic you can use to say the same thing, but with a fresh coat of paint over it. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's like the graphic I showed you where it's like, oh, we can't abolish slavery. What's going to happen to the economy? And then we see, well, we can't get rid of segregation. How are we going to coexist with people who don't look like us? And then we see, well, we can't get rid of police. Who's going to keep us safe? That's the same argument over and over and over again. Right. But we are using different words. We put a fresh coat of paint over it. Right. We've hot glued some sequins on it so it looks more flashy. But it is at its core the same argument because we have not abolished the structures that continue to perpetuate the same relationships.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues here. During your presentation, and again, this is really for viewers, I want to bring this to everyone's attention. During your presentation, you talked about something that we know here with the Office of Human Rights, how difficult it can be to get a job if you have to check a box, or when you check the box that says you don't have a felony. So I do want to let people know who are watching that in Prince George's County, there's legislation. It's for Fair Employment Standards Act, but it's known as Ban the Box. And what this legislation is, and it's been in existence 2014. It's been a minute. Hopefully someone will correct me on the date. But employers cannot ask you before the first interview if about your criminal history. And there's some exceptions to that rule. But, if you're out there, you're looking for work, or you hear of someone who's looking for work, or you go in and maybe, you're not somebody yourself who has a criminal record, but you happen to get a job application from somewhere, you're filling one out online, and there is that question. Please bring that to the attention of our office, because not everybody knows, of course, that is not allowed. And so there is protection here in the county, because we know that the purpose with Ban the Box is that after the first interview, at least people have a chance to get in the door. So I really appreciate you highlighting that. And I hope people can just, take that information. And if they ever want to hear more about that, you can also reach out to our office at the Office of Human Rights. But
go ahead.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing about that?
Yeah.
So Ban the Box is amazing. And beyond that, right, there's still employers are disincentivized to employ folks who are on probation or parole because there's all these rules, right? There's hours that they have to be back in their home. They have to check in with their parole officer. There's no excuse not to check in, or else you are right back in prison. The employer has to sign off on all these forms and vouch for them and stuff. So I think Ban the Box is an amazing first step, and I would love to see the county and the country take more steps toward accommodating folks who are on probation and parole to seek employment.
Yeah. Audrey, Tiana, do you have a question?
I do. I think my first one is, do we know why minimum wage in prison is only 13 cents an hour? Is it just because they can, or?
Did you want to say something, Laji?
You're muted, bud.
I spent 9 years in the local jail here in Prince George's County as a librarian, and so a lot of that wage is hacked apart by requirements that people have to pay for their care and their well-being, and so it's almost like room and board is subtracted out, and all these other fees. So they come up with this odd number of 13 or 14 cents and make it sound like it's a luxury, which it is not. But go ahead, Carolyn. I'm sure you have more.
No, that's really helpful information from a local jail. And it's also just crazy because if they're paying room and board, then what the heck am I paying taxes for? Right. Where is my money going? And it costs more to incarcerate someone than to send them to college. Where is all that money going? If on top of what I'm paying, which is more than a college tuition, for this, as a pooled tax-paying citizenry, and they're still having to pay on top of that, but their room and board conditions are garbage, right? So what's up, guys? Where's that money going?
I guess my question for you is, you mentioned the fact that your dissertation touches on Attica.
Yeah.
And for those of us who have worked inside a facility, and those of you who have heard of Attica, was Attica what drew you into this field, or was it something completely different? And can you talk about that a little bit? Because I know that that was a really, I mean, anytime anyone mentions the word riot in a facility, it freaks people out. It's scary.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious on your end, what brought you to this topic, and if it was Attica or something else, and how you talk about that.
Yeah, so I was an abolitionist before I knew about Attica. My kind of abolitionist journey, I grew up a white girl, upper middle class in Texas around people who were like me. And, prison is where the bad guys go, the end. And then as I got to college, which ironically, I was at a very conservative Baptist college. But I had a honors assignment to read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which, if you have not read that, is a great intro to all of this stuff. The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander. And she makes it very clear how we went from enslavement to our current prison industrial complex. And, 19-year-old me is like, why is nobody talking about this? And yeah, it turns out lots and lots of people have been talking about this for many years. They just don't look like me. And so I had a sweet little slice of humble pie when it was like, yeah, turns out I'm not the first person to discover this. And so I got into the literature. And at that point, I would have said I was a reformer. Like, something needs to change about this. But like, obviously, we need prisons. But as I got more into the literature and more connected with abolitionist communities, I was like, well, do we need prisons? And I've been more and more convinced that we don't, that they only cause harm and exist to uphold these hegemonic structures like Kyla brought up earlier. And so I was at that point when I started my PhD program. And so I wanted to explore that more through my PhD. And I took a social movements class, and the professor instructed us to write a paper about a social movement. And I was like, okay, well, I want to write about prison abolition. And that's kind of hard to write about like in a condensed way because it's such a like spread out movement. And so she suggested that I find a specific incident to anchor this in. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to look at like significant flashpoints in prison history. And so of course, Attica. And I was like, what's that? I wasn't alive in 1971. Let's see what's going on. And the more I learned about it, the more outraged I became. And so just like the 2-sentence version of what happened at Attica, for those who are not familiar, is, well, it might be more than 2 sentences. Sorry, dissertation brain. The men incarcerated in Attica had been asking to have their basic civil rights met for a very long time. Things like dealing with overcrowding. There was maggots in the food. A bunch of them were Muslims, but all the food had pork in it. More recreation time, better employment conditions, right? Basic stuff, clean water, right? A lot of times as a punishment, the water would get shut off to the whole prison. Like, that's crazy. And they had gone through all the quote unquote proper channels to have this taken care of, and they were just ignored, can't kick down the road, whatever. Well, it ended up that there was a big string of prison riots across the United States. And then some of the prisons in New York City, the residents of New York City were giving noise complaints about the prisoners there. So because those prisons were really overcrowded. And so the citizens were scared. So rather than decarcerating people or finding other solutions, they just shipped them all to Attica because that's out in the middle of nowhere, farmland, boonies, whatever. And so now in this maximum security facility in upstate New York at Attica, there's a bunch of people in a max security facility who are there for like writing a bad check or like protesting the Vietnam War. So you have a bunch of activists. It's way overcrowded, all these new transfers, and a bunch of them are like 20. And so they form the Attica Brotherhood, and they write up this manifesto of demands. They give it to the prison officials. The officials ignore them as usual. And so they're like, all right, we're going to do something about this. And so they see their chance. They start a riot, they lock all the doors, they take hostages, and they say, now you're going to listen to us because we have hostages. And the way that the state of New York responded to that was by sort of negotiating with them for a few days and then rounding them all up, hostages and prisoners alike, in one prison yard and just opening fire indiscriminately into the crowd. And they killed 43 people, 11 of whom were prison workers. So they killed their own people rather than negotiating with the men. And it was horrific. There was legal fallout for like decades afterward. Yeah. And so that was more than 2 sentences, but that's what happened to Attica. And that has continued to fuel my drive to be an abolitionist.
All right, so I know that, well, I have a lot I want to ask you, but I'm going to start, I guess I'll start my questions by talking about your we did talk about the fact that you were like almost Dr. Carolyn.
Yes.
So tell us about what's happening there?
Yeah, great question. If my advisor Carly is on the call, please be nice to me. Let me pass. Just kidding. Well, not really. So what happens?
She's not kidding.
What happens is you write a dissertation. So my dissertation is 5 written chapters interspersed with podcast episodes because I found a bunch of audio clips in the archives. So I have a bunch of clips of the Attica brothers speaking and saying like, this is what we want, this is who we are. And so rather than just the news clips of like, look at these barbarian animals being violent because they're crazy and bad criminals, right? I have them saying like, I am a human being, I deserve clean water. And so what I'm doing is telling a counter story of what happened to Attica. So the first chapter is what's called a stock story. So that's saying, here is kind of the hegemonic story that was told of what happened. But then counter story, which is a method of critical race theory, which I'm sure we've all heard about, is saying, well, here's actually a different version of the story from the perspective of those involved who were silenced. And how does that complicate our understanding? How does that complicate our public memory? And so I'm thinking about the rhetoric of riots and legitimizing riots as a form of communication that we can dissect and like find messages from, like we do with all kinds of rhetoric. And then I'm thinking about rhetorics of civility and citizenship and what that means in a prison context, and then how all this ties together in abolition. So you finished writing the dissertation. Mine is due in 19 days. Oh God, I have to.
And she's ready. She has it ready to go. That's what I'm hearing.
No.
So if her advisor's on the line, it's
Carly,
ready.
don't listen, Carly. And so I have to finish that, and then there will be 2 weeks for my committee to read it. And then on May 7th, I will have a defense where I'll give a short presentation on the dissertation. And that's open to the public. The public will be able to ask me questions about it. And then my committee will ask me questions about it. And then they will decide whether or not I'm Dr. Carolyn.
Wow. So when you talk about your thesis, your dissertation being, chapters interspersed with podcasts, so is it like a new media kind of dissertation, or are you having to?
Carly's listening.
Yes. Okay. Are you having to provide transcripts, or how does that work? I'm not trying to, but I am really curious about how this is going to be put together.
Yeah. So I am creating transcripts. I have all the licensing and permissions and everything from the archives, so there's no copyright issues. And so what I'm doing is kind of piecing together the story of Attica from the perspective of the Attica brothers as much as possible. But there's also the understanding, right, that they were silenced for decades and most of them have passed away now. And so there's going to be gaps and holes in the story. But I'm curating a counter story as much as I can to challenge hegemonic views of it toward an abolitionist goal. And so the dissertation, like if you just read straight through it and didn't listen to any of the podcast, you would read through the transcripts of what the podcast says as well. So it's like written stuff and then a QR code you can scan to listen to the podcast, a link you can click to listen to the podcast. So depending on if you're looking at it, print version or online version, and then transcripts. And then there's 3 little asterisks to show the podcast is over and now we're back into the writing.
That sounds really interesting. And speaking of podcasts for people who are watching, I did put links to Carolyn's podcast, both the Apple link and the Spotify link earlier in the chat on Facebook and YouTube. You should be able to find those. And actually, as she was presenting, Audrey and I were putting different links into the chat. So please go back to the chat feature to find some of the books that were mentioned and things like that. Tiana, I think you had a question and I maybe spoke over top of you. Am I right? Did you have a question?
I do. I guess my question is, for people who are listening or may find this video down the line, where can they get started in abolitionist work? Where can they start research, especially for, prison abolition?
Okay. Please hold while I get this book out from under my lamp. I'll show it to you. I just don't want to break my lamp. That would be really embarrassing. And it's at the bottom of the stack, so that's exciting. Okay, so I have a big stack of books from the publisher Haymarket Books. Haymarket, always going to have really great abolitionist resources. A lot of times they have them on sale. But this one is actually not from Haymarket, but this is Becoming Abolitionist by Derica Purnell. Sorry, I'm mirrored, so I have to think about how to show this. And I really, really like this book. I have my students read the introduction, actually, every semester, because she describes, like, I grew up calling 911, right? She grew up like in a she calls it a ghetto neighborhood, right, where they call the police for everything. You call the police for an asthma attack, right? But so she grew up like that, but still saw she saw two of her friends get shot in the neighborhood and die. And so she kind of had a journey of like 911 was a given, but then as she grew up, it was like, well, 911 was all we had. What if there was another option? How different would my life have looked? How different would my journey have looked? And my safety and the safety of my friends and my neighbors. And I think it's just a really accessible version because she acknowledges, like, it's scary to imagine these things. And it's hard to imagine these things because we're coming from this position of like, of course you call 911 when there's an emergency and the police come. And so that, I think, is a really great place to start because she acknowledges the starting point for most of us of like, this is what we know. This is ingrained in us.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're sort of at time, but if there's any, do we have a pressing which we go? Okay, I'm gonna cut us off then because we are getting close to 3, and we try to be timely for to respect everyone's time who's with us. Carolyn, this was very interesting. There's a lot of food for thought. I had many more things I wanted to talk to you about, such as your statement about capitalism cannot exist without exploitation. And I'm reading a book right now, Poverty by America, for a book group that we're doing. Our office with the library has a social justice book group, and we're talking about this book. And I feel like that is all in there. So there was so much that you had and so much food for thought. So thank you so much for being with us in your presentation. For everybody watching, thank you so much for tuning in. I mean, we do this for you. Thank you to Dr. Marsh from the University of Maryland for bringing this series and all these wonderful scholars to us, because week by week, we're just learning so much. And I feel really privileged to get to be in this space and learn from people. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to Audrey and Tiana. Carolyn, you were going to do so good at your dissertation. Carly, I think Carly's actually just writing your review right now.
Oh, okay, great.
So it was just wonderful to have you. Thank you, everybody. And please join us. We are doing this every week. Social justice and community continues every week between now and the second week of May. Then we're going to take a little break for the summer, and we will be doing it again in the fall and spring, maybe even expanding to include a few more schools from the graduate program. We're just working on that right now. So again, thank you, and take care, everybody. Have a great afternoon.